On June 3, 1950, two men stood higher than any human being in history. Within days, they would begin losing parts of their hands and feet to the cold. They had just achieved what scientists believed might be impossible, surviving above 8,000 meters. But on Annapurna, reaching the summit was never the real test. High above the terraced hills of central Nepal, an immense white massif rose into thinning air. To the villages scattered below, it was more than a mountain. It was a presence, beautiful from a distance, but known to move without warning. Avalanches fell from its flanks in silence. Storms gathered without pattern. Entire slopes reshaped themselves between seasons. In 1950, the world was rebuilding after war. Nations searched for proof that limits could still be broken. And in the Himalayas, one question remained unanswered. Could a human being stand above 8,000 meters and return alive? Exploration returned with renewed purpose. Blank spaces remained on maps, and among mountaineers there persisted a powerful conviction that the highest places on Earth were meant to be reached, no matter how hostile they appeared. At that time, no human being had ever stood atop a mountain higher than 8,000 meters. The altitude existed almost as an abstraction, a boundary scientists debated and climbers speculated about. Many believed the human body might simply fail before reaching such heights. Annapurna, at 8,091 meters, was not the tallest peak in the Himalayas, but it offered something others did not: possibility. Political barriers had delayed attempts on Everest, while Annapurna appeared remote yet accessible enough to attempt. Dangerous, certainly, but not forbidden. In the spring of 1950, a French expedition committed itself to a goal no one had yet achieved: the first ascent of an 8,000-meter mountain. The expedition was led by Maurice Herzog, a methodical mountaineer known less for dramatic speeches and more for disciplined focus. Those around him often noticed his composure. He approached risk analytically, rarely allowing emotion to shape his decisions. For Herzog, the climb was not simply personal ambition. It carried the weight of national pride and collective effort. At his side stood Lachenal, one of the most naturally gifted climbers of his era. Where Herzog brought structure, Lachenal brought instinct, an almost intuitive ability to read snow, anticipate instability, and sense subtle changes in terrain. Together they formed a partnership that blended caution with capability. The rest of the team assembled gradually: experienced alpinists, support staff, and a large network of local porters whose endurance made Himalayan expeditions possible. Equipment reflected the era. Ropes were heavier, boots stiffer, clothing less efficient at retaining warmth. Oxygen systems were still experimental and often unreliable. Every item carried upward demanded physical cost, and every kilogram mattered once the air began to thin. The journey toward the Himalayas unfolded slowly across continents: rail lines, cargo ships, rough roads that dissolved into dirt tracks. Weeks passed before the mountains themselves appeared, faint at first along the horizon. When they finally dominated the skyline, they did not resemble ordinary terrain. They looked ancient, immovable, and utterly indifferent to human timelines. By the time the expedition reached the edge of the trekking route, winter had only recently begun to retreat. The air retained a sharp coldness that hinted at what awaited above. The approach march lasted longer than many anticipated. Caravans threaded along narrow trails carved into steep hillsides. Bridges swayed above glacial rivers the color of powdered stone. Villages grew scarce, then vanished entirely. Gradually, the sensory world changed. Soil hardened into frost. Vegetation thinned until nothing remained but rock and wind. Even conversation diminished as altitude introduced its quiet pressure on the lungs. It was during this approach that the expedition encountered its first real uncertainty. The maps were incomplete. Much of the region had never been carefully surveyed from the ground. Valleys that appeared straightforward on paper twisted into complex networks of broken terrain. Glaciers branched unexpectedly. Towering ice formations leaned at angles that suggested eventual collapse. Progress slowed as the team searched for a viable path forward. Yet morale remained steady. Early in any expedition, optimism acts almost like insulation, keeping doubt at a distance. Base camp was eventually established on a moraine overlooking a vast basin of shifting ice. From there, Annapurna revealed its scale more fully. Its faces rose in immense bands of snow, layered over darker rock, slopes so wide they distorted depth perception. Features that appeared nearby often required hours to reach. Pale avalanche scars marked the mountain's surface, reminders not of rare disasters but of constant motion. At night, low reverberations occasionally rolled across the glacier, distant icefalls breaking loose somewhere in the darkness. Climbers would pause, listening, recalibrating their sense of proportion. On Annapurna, scale had a way of humbling even the most experienced alpinists. The weeks that followed were devoted to reconnaissance. Small teams advanced upward, studying possible routes before returning to debate their observations over carefully annotated maps. Some paths proved too exposed to avalanche corridors, others ended abruptly beneath vertical barriers. Each rejected route meant lost time, and in the Himalayas, time is never neutral. Weather windows open briefly, then vanish. Gradually, attention shifted toward a line along the north face. Technically demanding, yes, but seemingly less threatened by the continuous cascade zones visible elsewhere. The decision formed slowly through discussion rather than dramatic declaration. High-altitude choices rarely announce themselves. They accumulate until one direction begins to feel inevitable. With the route selected, the expedition settled into a rhythm that would define the coming weeks. Loads were carried upward in stages. Camps were established, stocked, and reinforced. Then climbers descended to recover before repeating the process higher. Establish Camp Y. Descend. Rest. Climb again with supplies. Establish Camp 2. The pattern continued until effort itself became routine. Yet Annapurna never allowed routine to feel entirely safe. Snow conditions could transform overnight. A surface that supported weight in the morning might fracture by afternoon. More than once, climbers noticed fine cracks spreading outward from their steps, delicate lines whispering across the snow before disappearing into glare. Higher still, altitude imposed its quiet discipline. Movements slowed. Simple tasks required focus. Removing gloves for too long invited immediate pain as cold gripped exposed skin. Metal burned at the touch. Breath came faster, then slower, as bodies adapted imperfectly to the thinning air. Despite fatigue, something else began to emerge. Proximity. The summit, once theoretical, now hovered above them with growing definition. Distance was turning into possibility. And yet, the mountain continued to issue reminders. One afternoon, while traversing beneath a heavily loaded slope, a subtle vibration passed through the snowpack, not loud, but unmistakably alive. The climbers stopped instantly. For several seconds, nothing followed. Then, far above, a plume detached from the ridge. It accelerated with terrifying speed, gathering mass as it descended. The avalanche did not strike their position, but its passage erased any lingering illusion of control. Movement here was conditional. Survival was never guaranteed. That evening, conversation inside the tents was quieter. No one spoke of retreat, but the mountain had altered the psychological landscape. Respect deepened into vigilance. Days later, Camp the rose at an altitude where the curvature of the horizon became faintly perceptible and the sky darkened toward a deeper blue. Sleep grew irregular. Appetite faded. Even melting snow for water demanded effort. Then the weather shifted, winds eased, visibility improved. The atmosphere steadied just enough to suggest a narrow window forming. Such windows are never invitations. They are opportunities, fragile and temporary. Herzog studied the conditions carefully. Summit attempts are never singular decisions. They emerge from dozens of smaller calculations. Strength was evaluated, supplies counted, frostbite checked, timing considered. Gradually, the conclusion became unavoidable. Two climbers would go higher when the mountain allowed. The announcement surprised no one, Herzog and Lachenal. On the morning chosen for the attempt, the world beyond their camp seemed suspended in rare clarity. Peaks extended in every direction, their shadows stretching across distant ice fields. Preparation unfolded without ceremony, ropes checked, axes secured, goggles adjusted against the glare. Above them lay terrain no human being had ever crossed. As they stepped beyond the perimeter of camp, their figures diminished quickly against the immense slope. Those remaining watched until detail dissolved, and the climbers became small movements against overwhelming white. Summit pushes rarely begin with triumph. More often, they begin with quiet departure, two individuals moving into an environment where assistance cannot reach them, where each decision subtly narrows the margin between continuation and retreat. Behind them, the expedition settled into a long vigil, and high above the last established camp, Herzog and Lachenal continued upward into thinning air, unaware that the mountain was already preparing the test that would define their ascent, and that the greatest challenge of Annapurna would not begin at the summit, but on the way back down. Above Camp Vir, the mountain steepened into a long corridor of wind-hardened snow that reflected the early light with blinding intensity. Herzog and Lachenal moved slowly, their bodies already negotiating the cost of altitude with every step. There was no rhythm now, only persistence. Lift the foot, drive the crampon into the surface, shift weight, breathe, repeat. Speech became unnecessary. At over 7,000 meters, even short sentences demanded oxygen they could not spare. The cold had deepened overnight. It pressed through fabric, crept into muscle, stiffened fingers despite layered gloves. When they paused, it arrived faster, as if motion alone held it at bay. The mountain above remained silent, offering no indication of how much terrain still separated them from the summit. They carried no reliable oxygen support. In 1950, such systems were heavy, unpredictable, and often viewed with skepticism. Their ascent would rely entirely on physiology and resolve, a calculation few had ever tested at this altitude. As morning advanced, the slope sharpened. The Himalayas extended outward in immense silence, ridge after ridge dissolving into atmospheric haze. Yet the scale offered no comfort. In places like this, distance did not mean safety, it meant isolation. Sometime late in the ascent, Lachenal began noticing a dull absence where sensation should have been. His fingers responded sluggishly when he flexed them. He understood immediately what this suggested. Frostbite rarely begins with dramatic pain. It starts quietly, replacing feeling with an eerie neutrality. He raised the concern, not with alarm, but with the clarity of someone who knew the cost of delay. Continuing higher would increase exposure. Turning back would abandon an objective that now felt almost within reach. Herzog considered the warning. The summit remained unseen, concealed beyond a broad shoulder of the mountain. Yet conditions held steady. No immediate storm threatened. Retreat, too, carried risk. Descending unfamiliar terrain, while exhausted, could prove equally dangerous. They chose to continue. The mountain eased gradually, the slope softening until upward motion no longer felt like resistance against gravity. Then, almost imperceptibly, the terrain leveled. There was no dramatic crest, no towering marker announcing arrival. Only the quiet realization that there was nowhere left to climb. Shortly after 2 in the afternoon, Maurice Herzog stepped onto the summit of Annapurna. Moments later, Lachenal joined him. For the first time in history, human beings stood above 8,000 meters. Around them, the world fell away in every direction. Peaks pierced the cloud layer like distant islands. Valleys lay buried beneath a luminous haze. The curvature of the earth hinted subtly along the horizon. Yet the summit itself offered little comfort. It was narrow, exposed, and swept by steady wind. There was no safe platform for rest, no shelter from the cold that intensified whenever they paused. Herzog later spoke of the moment not as triumph, but as clarity, a stillness sharpened by the awareness that they had crossed a boundary long believed unreachable. But altitude permits no lingering. Time had already begun to close around them. Lachenal's hands were worsening. Numbness gave way to a deep, internal burning that experienced climbers recognized with dread. Tissue freezing from within rarely reversed without consequence. They worked quickly, taking only a few photographs as proof of their achievement. The gestures were efficient, almost procedural. Celebration belonged to lower altitudes. Within minutes, they turned toward descent. Mountaineering history would eventually repeat a hard truth. Summits are optional, but returning is mandatory. The first steps downward felt strangely unfamiliar. Terrain that had guided them upward now appeared subtly altered under shifting light. Tracks softened by wind blurred into the surrounding surface. Cloud formations began rising from below, gathering with quiet determination. Visibility narrowed. The horizon dissolved into diffuse gray. Snow crystals lifted into the air, driven by strengthening currents. They pressed on. At one point, Herzog removed a glove briefly to adjust his camera. The exposure lasted only seconds, yet when he forced his hand back inside, sensation had already begun to fade. He flexed his fingers, willing warmth back into them, but circulation responded slowly. The descent demanded precision, yet fatigue was accumulating in ways neither man could fully measure. Muscles trembled beneath the strain. Reaction times lengthened. Late in the afternoon, Herzog stumbled. The fall was short, halted quickly by instinct and training, but it sent a clear message. Reserve strength was diminishing. Cloud thickened further. Landmarks disappeared. Navigation shifted from sight to memory. By the time the altitude of Camp 4 should have been near, both climbers were operating on persistence rather than power. Relief should have accompanied the sight of their tent, yet when its outline finally emerged through drifting snow, another challenge became apparent. Wind had partially buried the camp. They dug with stiff hands, movements clumsy from cold. When they finally forced entry, the relative shelter felt almost surreal, but the damage was already unfolding. Herzog examined his fingers. The skin appeared pale, almost translucent. Lachenal's condition was worse. Pain surged in waves that alternated with dangerous numbness. Through the night, temperatures plunged further. Sleep fractured into brief intervals between shivering spells. Each hour increased the likelihood that frozen tissue would not recover. Morning arrived without ceremony, a muted light filtering through frost-stiffened fabric. The storm had eased enough to permit movement, but hesitation was no longer possible. They had to go down. Descending beyond Camp 4 became an exercise in endurance stripped to essentials. Equipment was redistributed. Loads were abandoned. Efficiency replaced caution wherever possible. Other members of the expedition began climbing upward to assist, yet rescue at altitude is never immediate. Every step upward costs energy, and those offering help must survive the same environment. As Herzog and Lachenal continued downward, the true price of the summit declared itself. Sensation in their extremities receded further. Boots felt fused to unresponsive feet. Hands resisted even simple tasks. Still they moved. Hours blurred together. Slope after slope, rope after rope, camp after camp. At one exposed traverse, Herzog slipped again, sliding several meters before arresting himself. Snow filled his clothing. For a moment, the possibility of unstoppable momentum flickered, then passed. When they finally dropped below the most hazardous gradients, members of the expedition met them with visible relief. News of the summit spread quickly through the team, but celebration remained restrained. The condition of the climbers overshadowed everything. Over the following days, the descent toward base camp unfolded with painful clarity. Frostbite advanced beyond doubt. Skin darkened. Swelling increased. Every attempt at rewarming triggered searing pain. Medical resources were limited. Treatment consisted largely of protection from further cold and the fragile hope that some tissue might yet survive. By the time they reached safer altitude, the outcome was becoming unavoidable. Both men had achieved what no one before them had, and both would carry permanent evidence of the cost. In the months that followed, surgeons would amputate fingers and toes destroyed by the cold endured during their descent. The summit had secured their place in history. Survival demanded sacrifice. Yet their ascent transformed mountaineering forever. It proved that humans could function, however precariously, in the highest reaches of the planet. Expeditions that followed would refine equipment, improve acclimatization, and study weather with far greater attention. But one lesson endured above all others. Reaching the top is only half the journey. On mountains like Annapurna, danger does not end at the summit. Often, it is only beginning. Decades later, climbers would continue to approach its slopes, drawn by ambition, curiosity, and the enduring question that accompanies exploration. How far can a human being go before nature sets the final boundary? Some would stand where Herzog and Lachenal once stood. Others would vanish into the mountain's vast silence. Annapurna remains what it has always been: immense, unpredictable, and indifferent to the stories written briefly upon its ridges. If you stayed with this story until the end, thank you for watching. Stories like this remind us that exploration is never only about conquest, but about the limits humans are willing to face in the pursuit of the unknown. If you enjoy immersive historical expeditions and want to continue exploring the most extreme places on Earth, consider subscribing to the channel and joining us for the journeys ahead. There are many more stories waiting beyond the horizon, and I look forward to sharing them with you.